"You're not invited to the wedding," my daughter said. And just like that, 40 years of motherhood fell silent in the space between her words and my breath. I remember the exact way she said it too, not with anger, not even with hesitation, but with a calm finality that made it worse, like she had practiced it in front of a mirror until it no longer sounded cruel, only necessary. I was standing in her kitchen, still holding the small white box I had brought with me, a pair of pearl earrings I had saved up for over 3 months to buy, something simple but elegant, something I thought she might wear on her big day. The afternoon sun came through the tall windows behind her, casting soft light across the marble countertops she had once proudly shown me when she moved in. But in that moment, everything felt distant, like I was looking at someone else's life through glass. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and I had always believed that no matter how complicated life became, there were certain moments that held families together, weddings being one of them. I had imagined this day since Emily was a little girl, back when she used to wrap herself in bed sheets and pretend they were wedding gowns, twirling around our living room while I sat on the couch pretending to cry happy tears. Back then, she would run to me afterward, breathless and laughing, and say, "You'll be there, right, Mom? You have to sit in the front row." I always told her the same thing, that there was nowhere else in the world I would ever be. But now, standing there in her kitchen, I realized that somewhere along the way, that promise had been quietly erased. I didn't respond right away. I've learned over the years that silence can carry more dignity than any argument ever could. I set the small box down gently on the counter, careful not to let my hands shake, though I could feel the tremor running through my fingers. "I understand," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. Emily shifted slightly, crossing her arms as if bracing herself, but she didn't look relieved, not really. If anything, she looked impatient, like she was waiting for me to make things harder so she could justify what she had just done. "It's just, we want the day to feel right," she added, her tone softer now, but still distant, still carefully measured. "There are going to be a lot of people there, important people, and we don't want anything to feel uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. I let that word settle in my mind, turning it over slowly, trying to understand how a mother could become something that needed to be managed, adjusted, or removed for the sake of comfort. Behind her, I noticed a stack of glossy invitations on the table, thick paper with gold lettering, the kind you only see in magazines or expensive hotels. I hadn't received one, of course, but seeing them there made the reality feel heavier, more official, like the decision had been made long before this conversation ever happened. I thought about the nights Robert and I had spent talking about her wedding, how we had offered to help, how we had quietly set aside money from our retirement savings because we wanted her to have everything she dreamed of, even if it meant cutting back on things for ourselves. Robert was waiting for me in the car outside, probably listening to the radio and glancing at the front door every few minutes, expecting me to come out smiling, maybe even a little emotional, telling him about flower arrangements or seating charts. He had polished his shoes that morning, something he hadn't done in years, because he said he wanted to look presentable when he met Daniel's family again. I wondered how I was going to explain this to him without letting my voice break. Emily picked up her phone, glancing at a message, and for a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be disappear completely, replaced by someone I didn't quite recognize, someone who measured people by how well they fit into a picture she was trying to create. "I hope you're not taking this the wrong way," she said, though we both knew there was no other way to take it. I nodded once, not trusting myself to say more. I reached for my purse, the leather worn soft from years of use, and turned toward the door. Each step felt deliberate, like I was memorizing the sound of my own footsteps leaving a place I might never truly return to. Just before I opened the door, I paused, my hand resting on the handle, and I looked back at her one last time. There were so many things I could have said in that moment, so many questions, so many reminders of everything we had been to each other, but none of them would have changed what she had already decided. So instead, I simply nodded again, a quiet acknowledgement of a new reality neither of us could undo, and then I walked out into the bright afternoon light, closing the door behind me without a sound. I could feel the weight of the door closing behind me long after I had already stepped outside, like something had shifted permanently and there was no quiet way to put it back. The late afternoon air was warm, just under 70 degrees, the kind of gentle spring weather that usually made everything feel hopeful. But that day it only made the contrast sharper, as if the world had decided to move forward without asking whether I was ready to follow. Robert looked up the moment I walked toward the car, his expression softening into that familiar smile he had worn for over 40 years, the same one that used to steady me in moments when I felt unsure, but now it made my chest tighten in a way I could not immediately explain. He leaned over slightly from the driver's seat and opened the passenger door from the inside, a small habit he had never let go of. Even after his knees started bothering him, and getting in and out of the car took more effort than it used to. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice warm, hopeful, completely unaware of the quiet fracture that had just taken place inside that house. I settled into the seat slowly, placing my purse on my lap, taking a moment longer than usual to close the door, as if I needed that extra second to decide which version of the truth I was going to give him. The interior of the car smelled faintly of the cologne he had worn that morning, something he only used on special occasions now, and I noticed how carefully he had combed his hair, how his shirt was pressed just a little more sharply than usual. He had been preparing himself to be seen, to be part of something important, and I realized that what I was about to say would take that away from him in a way he had not yet had time to understand. "She is busy," I said at first, my voice even, my eyes fixed on the dashboard as if I could find the right words somewhere between the radio dial and the clock. Robert nodded, not suspicious, just patient, giving me space the way he always had. "That makes sense," he replied. "These things can get complicated. Did you talk about the ceremony?" I could hear the genuine curiosity in his tone, the quiet pride of a father who had been waiting for this moment longer than he would ever admit out loud. I folded my hands together, noticing the faint lines on my skin, the way time had left its marks so gently yet so clearly, and I thought about how many of those years had been spent building a life centered around our daughter. "We will not be attending," I said finally, the words landing in the space between us with a calmness that did not match the weight they carried. Robert did not respond immediately. The engine was still off, and for a few seconds, all I could hear was the distant sound of a lawn mower somewhere down the street, and the faint ticking of the car cooling in the sun. He turned his head slowly toward me, not sharply, not with anger, but with a kind of careful attention, like he was making sure he had heard me correctly. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice lower now, more focused. I kept my gaze forward. "She thinks it is better this way," I said. "She wants the day to feel a certain way." I did not repeat the exact words Emily had used. I did not say the word uncomfortable again. Some things, once spoken, do not need to be repeated to be understood. Robert leaned back slightly in his seat, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his fingers tightening just enough for me to notice. He had always been a man of measured reactions, someone who believed that raising his voice solved very little, but I could see the shift in him, the way his posture changed, the way his breathing slowed as he processed what I had said. "Did she say why?" he asked. There was no accusation in his tone, only a quiet search for logic, for something that could make sense of what did not. I let out a small breath, not quite a sigh, more like the release of something I had been holding in since the moment Emily spoke. "She is worried about how things will look," I answered. "About the people who will be there." Robert stared ahead through the windshield, his eyes focused on something distant, something beyond the quiet suburban street in front of us. For a moment, he said nothing, and in that silence, I could feel the years between us, all the small sacrifices, all the ordinary days that had added up to a life we had built together, a life that now seemed to have been quietly edited out of someone else's story. Finally, he nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. "I see," he said, and in those two words, I could hear everything he was not saying, the disappointment, the confusion, the quiet recognition that something fundamental had changed. He started the engine then, the sound filling the car, giving us something to focus on other than the conversation we had just had. As we pulled away from the curb, I glanced back once at the house, at the large windows and the neatly trimmed hedges, at the place where I had just been told, in the calmest voice possible, that I no longer belonged in one of the most important moments of my daughter's life. I did not feel anger, not yet. What I felt was something quieter, something steadier, like the beginning of a realization that had been forming for a long time, without my permission. I turned forward again, resting my hands in my lap, and as the car moved down the street, I understood for the first time that this was not just about a wedding. It was about a place I thought I would always have. In the moment, I finally saw that it was no longer there. That evening, the house felt larger than it had that morning, as if the space itself had stretched to make room for something we had lost without realizing it. I walked into the kitchen out of habit, setting my purse down on the same chair I always used, and for a moment I stood there, unsure of what I had come into. The clock on the wall read 5:23, the exact time I would usually start preparing dinner, something simple and familiar, something that had never required much thought, because routine had always carried me through the end of the day. But now, even that felt uncertain, like the small rhythms of my life had been quietly interrupted. Robert moved more slowly than usual, hanging his jacket on the back of the chair instead of the hook by the door, his movements deliberate, thoughtful, as if he was measuring each action against something he had not yet put into words. Neither of us spoke at first. There was no need to fill the silence, because it was not empty. It was full of understanding that did not require explanation. I reached for the kettle, filling it with water and placing it on the stove, the simple act grounding me in a way I could not quite explain. The sound of the burner clicking to life was steady, predictable, something that did not change no matter what happened outside of it. "Do you remember her first school play?" Robert asked suddenly, his voice quiet but clear. I paused, my hand resting lightly on the counter, surprised by the direction of his thoughts, but not by the memory itself. "The one where she forgot her lines," I said, turning slightly toward him. He nodded. "She just stood there on stage, completely frozen. I could see it as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. Emily at 8 years old, standing under the bright auditorium lights, her small hands clutching the edge of her costume, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found us. You stood up," Robert continued, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. "You mouthed the words to her from the front row. I felt something shift inside me, not pain exactly, but a recognition of how far we had come from that moment, how much had changed in ways we had not fully noticed at the time. She finished the whole scene after that," I said softly. "She did not miss a single line." Robert leaned back slightly against the counter, his arms crossed loosely, his gaze distant. "She needed to know we were there," he said. The kettle began to hum, the low sound building slowly, and I turned it off before it could whistle, pouring the hot water into 2 cups without asking if he wanted tea. Some things did not need to be confirmed. I handed him one, and he took it with a small nod, his fingers brushing mine briefly, a quiet reassurance that we were still on the same side of something, even if we were not entirely sure what that something was anymore. "When did it change?" he asked after a moment. It was not a question filled with blame, but with genuine curiosity, the kind that comes from trying to understand a shift that did not happen all at once, but over time, in ways that are easy to overlook until they are impossible to ignore. I thought about the past few years, about the small things that had seemed insignificant on their own, but now formed a pattern I could not unsee. The shorter phone calls, the missed holidays explained away by busy schedules, the way Emily had started to speak about her life as if it existed in a different world, one that we were occasionally allowed to observe but not truly be part of. "It did not happen all at once," I said carefully. "It happened little by little." Robert nodded slowly, absorbing that, his expression thoughtful. "I suppose that is how most things change," he replied. I sat down at the table, wrapping my hands around the warm cup, feeling the heat seep into my fingers, steady and consistent. "She has built a different life," I continued. "And in that life, we do not fit the way we used to." Saying it out loud made it feel more real, more defined, like drawing a line that had already been there, but had not yet been acknowledged. Robert took a sip of his tea, then set the cup down, his movements controlled. "That does not mean we have to accept being treated as if we do not belong at all," he said. There was no anger in his voice, only a quiet firmness that I recognized from moments in our past, when he had decided something was not right and was not going to pretend otherwise. I looked at him then, really looked, noticing the lines around his eyes, the way time had shaped him into someone steady, someone who did not react quickly but thought deeply before he spoke. "No," I said, "it does not." The room felt different after that, not lighter, but clearer, as if something had been named that could no longer hide in the background. I took a slow breath, letting it out evenly, and for the first time since that afternoon, I felt a sense of direction beginning to form, not fully defined, but present. I stood up, carrying my cup to the sink, rinsing it carefully, the water running steadily as I set it aside to dry. Behind me, I could hear Robert move toward the living room, the soft creak of the floorboards familiar and grounding. I dried my hands on a towel and followed him, pausing briefly in the doorway as I looked at the room we had spent decades filling with memories, with laughter, with the kind of ordinary moments that do not seem significant until you realize they have shaped everything. I stepped inside, taking a seat across from him, and as the evening light softened through the windows, I understood that whatever came next, it would not be defined by what we had just lost, but by what we chose to do with that loss. That night, after the lights were turned off and the house settled into its usual quiet, I found myself lying awake longer than I had in years, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling as the soft glow from the streetlight filtered through the curtains. Robert was already asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even, the kind of steady rhythm that used to comfort me without effort, but now it only reminded me of how much of our life had been built on the assumption that certain bonds were unbreakable. I turned slightly onto my side, careful not to disturb him, and let my thoughts drift backward, not by choice, but because they seemed to move on their own, pulling me through memories that had once felt simple and now carried a different weight. I saw Emily at 16, sitting at the kitchen table with her textbook spread out, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail as she struggled through a math problem that refused to make sense to her. I had been standing at the stove then, stirring a pot of soup, watching her from the corner of my eye as she sighed in frustration. "I am never going to get this," she had said, dropping her pencil onto the table. I remember turning down the heat, wiping my hands on a towel, and sitting beside her, going through the problem step by step until the confusion in her eyes slowly turned into understanding. When she finally got the answer right, she smiled at me with a kind of relief that made everything else in that moment feel worth it. "I do not know what I would do without you," she had said, half joking, half serious. At the time, I had laughed and told her that she would figure things out just fine on her own. But now, lying in the dark, I wondered when that sentence had stopped being true for her, or if perhaps it had only ever been true for me. Another memory followed without pause, one that felt even closer to the surface. Emily at 22, standing in our living room with a letter in her hand, her voice trembling as she read aloud the acceptance into the graduate program she had worked so hard to reach. Robert had clapped her on the shoulder, pride written plainly across his face, while I had hugged her tightly, feeling the kind of joy that comes from seeing someone you love step into a future they have earned. We had celebrated that night with takeout and a small cake from the grocery store, nothing extravagant, but it had not needed to be. What mattered was that we were together, that we were part of that moment, that we were included in the life she was building. I closed my eyes, letting that memory linger just long enough to feel its contrast with the present, then opened them again, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer some kind of explanation. The change had not announced itself. It had not come with a single event or a clear turning point. Instead, it had unfolded quietly, almost politely, like a door that had been closing slowly over time while I stood on the other side, unaware that I was being left out. I thought about the phone calls that had grown shorter, the visits that had become less frequent, the way conversations had shifted from shared experiences to updates that felt more like summaries than invitations into her life. I remembered the first time she had mentioned Daniel's family, how she had described them with a kind of admiration that was new, focused on things like their business connections, their homes, the events they attended. At the time, I had been happy for her, proud even, that she had found a place among people she respected, but now I wondered if that admiration had slowly turned into something else, something that required her to reshape parts of her life, including us, to fit a different image. I turned onto my back again, folding my hands over my stomach, feeling the steady rise and fall of my own breathing as I tried to piece together the moments I might have missed, the signs I had dismissed because they did not seem significant on their own. There had been the holiday she spent out of state, explaining that travel schedules made it difficult to come home. The birthday she acknowledged with a brief phone call instead of her usual visit. The time she gently suggested that we might feel out of place at one of her events, framing it as concern rather than exclusion. Each moment had been small, reasonable even, easy to accept without question, but now, Seen together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. I realized then that what had happened earlier that day was not sudden. It was the natural conclusion of something that had been developing for a long time, something I had not wanted to name because naming it would have meant accepting it. Beside me, Robert shifted slightly in his sleep, his hand moving just enough to brush against mine, and I let my fingers rest there, grounding myself in the one connection that had not changed, the one part of my life that remained steady despite everything else. I did not feel anger as I lay there. Not yet. What I felt was clarity, a quiet understanding that whatever place we had once held in Emily's life was no longer the same, and that pretending otherwise would only keep me standing outside a door that had already closed. I took a slow breath, letting it out evenly, and as the night stretched on around me, I began to understand that the question was no longer why things had changed, but what I was going to do now that I finally saw them for what they were. The next morning arrived with a kind of quiet. Clarity that only comes after a night spent thinking without interruption, and for the first time since the conversation in Emily's kitchen, I did not feel uncertain about what I needed to do, only about how I would begin. The sunlight came in through the dining room window at just past 7, casting long, soft lines across the table where I had once helped Emily with homework, where we had shared birthdays, holidays, and countless ordinary meals that now felt like pieces of a life that had slowly shifted without asking for permission. I made coffee the same way I always did, measuring carefully, letting the machine hum and drip as it filled the pot, the familiar routine grounding me in something steady and predictable. Robert joined me a few minutes later, already dressed, his movements quieter than usual but not uncertain, as if he had reached the same conclusion I had, just in his own way and in his own time. He sat across from me, wrapping his hands around his mug, and for a moment, we simply shared the silence, not as something empty, but as something understood. I have been thinking, he said finally, his voice calm but deliberate. I nodded slightly. So have I replied. There was no need to ask what we had been thinking about. The answer was already there between us. Robert looked down at the table for a moment, then back at me. We cannot pretend this did not happen, he said. And we cannot keep offering something that is not being accepted. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled into place without resistance. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth linger, then set the cup down carefully. No, I said. We cannot. I stood up then, not abruptly, but with a sense of purpose that felt new, or perhaps just newly acknowledged. I walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one where we kept our paperwork, our bills, and everything else that required attention but not urgency. I opened the top drawer and pulled out the folder we had started months ago, the one labeled in my handwriting with a single word, wedding. Inside were copies of contracts, receipts, notes, and numbers, all neatly organized in a way that had once made me feel helpful, involved, necessary. I carried the folder back to the table and set it down in front of Robert. He looked at it, then at me, and I could see the understanding in his eyes before either of us said anything more. You handled most of this, he said quietly. I nodded. She asked me to, I replied. She said it would make things easier. I opened the folder, flipping through the pages slowly, not because I needed to read them again, but because I needed to acknowledge what they represented. The venue reservation, the catering deposit, the floral arrangements, the transportation services, each one tied to a date, a time, a promise that had been made under the assumption that we were part of the event itself. I stopped at the contract for the venue, a large property just outside the city, the kind of place that looked beautiful in photographs, with wide open lawns and a reception hall that could hold over 200 guests. I remembered the day we had toured it, how Emily had walked through the space with a kind of excitement that made everything feel possible, how she had turned to me and said, "This is perfect, Mom." I closed the folder gently, resting my hands on top of it for a moment before looking back at Robert. All of this is in my name, I said. It was not a statement of power, just a statement of fact. Robert leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly. Then it is also your decision, he replied. The room felt still again, but not uncertain. I reached for my phone, picking it up with steady hands, and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for the venue coordinator. I had spoken to her several times over the past few months, always in the context of planning, of confirming details, of making sure everything would come together the way Emily wanted. Now, as I looked at her name on the screen, I understood that the nature of the conversation was about to change. I did not press call right away. Instead, I sat there for a moment, letting the weight of the decision settle fully into place, not as something impulsive, but as something considered, something that matched the clarity I had reached the night before. Robert did not interrupt. He simply watched, his presence steady, supportive, the way it had always been. Finally, I pressed the button and lifted the phone to my ear, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times before it was answered. "Good morning, this is Claire," the voice on the other end said, polite and professional. I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to mark the moment. "Good morning, Claire," I said. "This is Margaret Collins. I am calling regarding the reservation for June." There was a brief pause, the sound of papers shifting, a keyboard clicking softly in the background. "Of course, Mrs. Collins," she replied. "How can I assist you today?" I glanced down at the folder in front of me, then back up, my gaze steady. "I would like to cancel the event," I said. The words came out evenly, without hesitation, without explanation, because none was needed. On the other end of the line, there was a moment of silence, the kind that comes when expectations shift unexpectedly. "I understand," Claire said after a second, her tone adjusting, professional but slightly more careful now. "May I ask if there is a particular reason?" I allowed myself a small pause, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted to choose my words with the same clarity I had felt all morning. "The circumstances have changed," I replied, "and I am no longer participating." There was nothing more to add. The decision had already been made. Claire's voice remained steady on the other end of the line, but I could hear the subtle shift in her tone, the way professionalism adjusted when a situation no longer followed the expected path. "I understand, Mrs. Collins," she said carefully. "I will begin the cancellation process. There are some policies regarding deposits, but I will review everything and do my best to minimize any loss." I listened without interrupting, not because I was concerned about the details, but because I had already accepted that whatever remained or did not remain was no longer the point. "That is fine," I replied. "Please proceed." We went over a few final confirmations, dates, reference numbers, and then the call ended as simply as it had begun. I lowered the phone and placed it gently on the table, my hand resting beside it for a moment, as if acknowledging the quiet finality of what had just been set in motion. Robert did not ask what was said. He did not need to. He had heard enough to understand. Instead, he nodded once, a small, steady gesture that carried more agreement than any words could have. "One step at a time," he said. I allowed myself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Yes," I replied. "One step at a time." The rest of the morning unfolded with a calm that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. I made a short list, writing it down in my usual careful handwriting, each item clear and deliberate. Catering, florist, transportation, photographer. Names and numbers followed, each one representing another piece of something that no longer belonged to us. I moved through them methodically, making each call with the same tone I had used before, polite, composed, direct. Some of the vendors were surprised, others more understanding, but all of them responded in the same professional way, adjusting schedules, noting cancellations, confirming details. With each conversation, I felt something shift, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but internally, like a structure that had been built around expectation was being carefully taken down, piece by piece. By late morning, the list was nearly complete. I stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the quiet street, the same street where Emily had learned to ride her bicycle, where Robert had once run beside her, one hand lightly holding the back of the seat until she found her balance. I could still picture the exact moment he let go, the way she wobbled for a second before steadying herself, the look of surprise and pride on her face when she realized she was moving forward on her own. At the time, it had been a moment of growth, of independence, something to celebrate. Now, the memory carried a different meaning, not painful, but clearer, as if I was finally seeing it from the other side. Robert joined me by the window, standing close but not touching, his presence steady as always. "Have you heard from her?" he asked quietly. I shook my head once. "No," I said, "and I do not expect to." He did not respond right away. He simply looked out at the street with me, his gaze calm but thoughtful. "She will notice," he said after a moment. When things do not go as planned. I considered that, not with anticipation, but with a kind of quiet acceptance. Yes, I said. She will. There was no satisfaction in the thought, no sense of victory. Only the recognition that actions have consequences, whether we intend them or not. I turned away from the window and walked back to the table, closing the folder and placing it neatly back in the drawer where it had been before, its purpose now complete. The label on the front still read wedding, but it no longer held the same meaning. It was simply a record of something that had been planned under different assumptions. The house felt different again, not empty, not heavy, but settled, as if it had adjusted to a new understanding of itself. I moved through the room slowly, not searching for anything, just noticing the framed photographs on the walls, the small details that had remained constant even as everything else had shifted. In the living room, I paused in front of a picture of Emily taken years ago, her hair shorter, her smile unguarded, her expression open in a way that did not yet measure how it would be perceived. I studied it for a moment, not with longing, but with recognition, acknowledging both who she had been and who she had become, without trying to force them into the same image. Behind me, I could hear Robert turning on the television, the low sound filling the space with something familiar, something that did not ask questions or require answers. I took a slow breath, letting it out evenly, and for the first time since everything had begun, I felt a sense of alignment between what had happened and how I had responded. There was no rush, no urgency, no need to explain or justify. Only a quiet, steady awareness that the path we were on now was one we had chosen with clarity, and that whatever came next would be met the same way, without noise, without regret, and without stepping back into a place where we were no longer wanted. It was just past noon when the phone finally rang, the sound cutting through the quiet of the house in a way that felt sharper than usual, as if it already carried the weight of what it was about to bring. I was in the kitchen, rinsing a plate I had not even used, more out of habit than need, and for a moment I simply stood there, letting it ring once, twice, 3 times, before drying my hands and walking toward the table where I had left my phone. I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. Some calls announce themselves before you ever answer them. I picked it up, glanced down, and saw Emily's name exactly where I expected it to be. I let it ring one more time before answering, not to make a point, but to give myself a single breath of stillness before stepping into whatever came next. "Hello," I said, my voice calm, steady, the same tone I had used all morning. There was a pause on the other end, not long, but long enough to feel deliberate. "Mom," she said, and there was something different in her voice now, not softer exactly, but less controlled, as if whatever she had planned to say had already been interrupted by something unexpected. "What is going on?" I leaned slightly against the edge of the table, my free hand resting flat on the surface, grounding myself in the familiar. "What do you mean?" I asked, not because I did not understand, but because I wanted her to say it, to place the words into the space between us herself. "The venue just called me," she said, her voice tightening slightly. "They said the reservation has been canceled. And the caterer too. And the florist is not answering my planner anymore. Did you do this?" I did not answer immediately, not out of hesitation, but because I believed in allowing silence to hold its place, to let the reality settle without rushing to fill it. "Yes," I said after a moment, my voice even. There was another pause, this one longer, heavier. "Why would you do that?" she asked, and now there was something else in her tone, something closer to disbelief than anger, as if the possibility had not fully existed for her until this moment. I straightened slightly, not because I needed to, but because the question deserved a clear answer, not an emotional one. "Because I am no longer part of the event," I said, and those arrangements were made under a different understanding. On the other end, I could hear her breathing, slightly uneven now, the sound of someone trying to quickly reorganize a situation that was no longer within their control. "That does not make any sense," she said, the words coming faster now. "Just because you are not attending does not mean you cancel everything. There are other people involved. Daniel's family is expecting this. Do you have any idea how this looks?" I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of frustration, but to focus on the clarity I had held on to since the morning. When I opened them again, my gaze settled on the window, on the quiet street beyond it, unchanged by the conversation taking place inside. I understand that it affects more than just you, I replied. But I will not continue to support something I have been asked to step away from. There was a shift then, a subtle one, but unmistakable. The conversation was no longer about confusion. It was about control. You are overreacting, she said, her voice sharper now. I told you it was just about keeping things comfortable. It is one day. You could have just accepted it and let everything move forward. I let her words settle without interruption, hearing not just what she was saying, but what she believed, that participation could be selective, that support could be expected without presence, that roles could be adjusted without consequence. I did accept it, I said calmly. I accepted that I am not included, and I acted accordingly. The silence that followed was different from the others. It was not uncertain. It was not searching. It was the kind of silence that forms when two people finally understand that they are standing on opposite sides of something that cannot be negotiated. This is going to cause a lot of problems, she said finally, her voice lower now, more controlled again, but not as steady as before. I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it. Yes, I said. It probably will. I did not raise my voice. I did not add anything more. There was nothing else that needed to be explained. On the other end, I could hear movement, the faint sound of voices in the background, perhaps Daniel, perhaps someone else, but it did not matter. The situation had already shifted beyond the point where outside voices could change it. I cannot believe you would do this, she said. And this time, there was something closer to hurt beneath the frustration, something that might have once moved me to reconsider, to soften, to adjust. But that part of me had already been addressed, already been acknowledged, already been placed where it belonged. I did not do this to you, I replied quietly. I responded to what was already done. The words were simple, but they held everything I had come to understand, everything I had chosen not to ignore anymore. There was no immediate response. Just a long, quiet space where neither of us spoke, where the distance between us was no longer measured in miles or minutes, but in decisions that had been made on both sides. Finally, the line went silent, not with a goodbye, not with a resolution, but with the quiet ending of a conversation that had revealed exactly what it needed to reveal. I lowered the phone slowly, placing it back on the table with the same care I had used all morning, and stood there for a moment, not waiting, not wondering, just acknowledging that what had been set in motion was now fully visible, no longer hidden beneath polite explanations or careful words. Outside, the day continued as it always did, steady and unchanged, and inside, I felt the same clarity settle again, quiet, firm, and unmistakable. The house remained quiet after the call ended, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, not the stillness of uncertainty, but the calm that follows a decision that cannot be undone. I stood by the table for a few moments, my hand resting lightly against the surface, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingertips as if it could anchor me in the present. There was no rush to move, no urgency to fill the space with sound. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken, and everything that needed to be understood had already settled into place. In the living room, the television continued playing at a low volume, some daytime program that Robert had turned on earlier, the voices blending into a soft background noise that made the house feel lived in without demanding attention. I walked in slowly and took a seat across from him, noticing how he looked up briefly, searching my expression not for answers, but for confirmation. She called, I said simply. Robert nodded once, as if he had been expecting that moment since the morning. And he asked, not pressing, just allowing the conversation to unfold at its own pace. I folded my hands together in my lap, my posture relaxed, my voice steady. She was surprised, I replied. She did not expect things to change. Robert let out a quiet breath, not quite a sigh, more like an acknowledgement of something that had already been understood before it was spoken aloud. People rarely do, he said. They expect things to stay where they left them. I considered that for a moment, the simplicity of his words carrying a kind of truth that did not need elaboration. She said it would cause problems, I added. Robert gave a faint nod, his gaze steady. It will, he said, but not the kind she thinks. There was no bitterness in his tone, only clarity, the kind that comes from seeing a situation without trying to soften it. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the quiet settle around us again. Not heavy, not uncomfortable, just present. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, the sound fading as quickly as it came, a reminder that life continued at its own pace, unaffected by the shifts happening inside our home. Do you regret it? Robert asked after a while, his voice calm, without judgment. I shook my head gently. No, I said. The answer came easily, without hesitation, because it was not based on emotion, but on understanding. I regret that it came to this, I continued, but not what I did. Robert watched me for a moment, then nodded again, his expression thoughtful. That is the difference, he said. We sat there for a while longer, not speaking, not needing to, the silence between us steady and familiar, shaped by years of shared understanding rather than the absence of words. After some time, I stood up and walked back toward the kitchen, not because there was anything urgent to do, but because movement felt natural, a continuation of the day rather than an escape from it. I rinsed the same plate again, though it was already clean, then dried it carefully and placed it back in the cabinet, the small, ordinary action grounding me in a sense of routine that had not been taken away. On the counter, my phone remained still, no new notifications, no additional calls. I knew there would be more conversations eventually, more reactions, more consequences unfolding in ways I could not yet see, but I did not feel the need to anticipate them. Whatever came next would come in its own time, and I would meet it the same way I had met everything else so far, with quiet clarity and without stepping back into something I had already stepped away from. I walked to the window and looked out again at the street, the sunlight now slightly higher, the shadows shorter, the day moving forward as it always did. Somewhere, not far from here, plans were shifting, expectations unraveling, conversations happening in rooms I was no longer part of, but for the first time, I did not feel the need to be there, to explain, to defend, or to adjust myself to fit into something that no longer included me. I understood now that absence is not always something imposed from the outside. Sometimes, it is something we choose, not out of anger, but out of respect for ourselves, a quiet refusal to stand where we are not wanted. Behind me, I could hear Robert stand up, his footsteps slow but steady as he moved toward the kitchen, joining me without a word. He stood beside me at the window, our shoulders close, not touching, but aligned, both of us looking out at the same quiet street, the same ordinary day that no longer felt quite the same. Whatever happens next, he said softly, we face it together. I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, everything else faded into the background, the conversations, the decisions, the changes that had already taken place. We always have, I replied. And in that moment, I realized that while something had been taken away, something else had been made clearer, something that had been there all along but had not needed to be named until now. The day continued, steady and unchanged, but within it, something had shifted in a way that no longer depended on anyone else's approval, expectation, or acceptance. It simply existed, quiet, firm, and entirely our own. The rest of the day moved forward without interruption, but beneath its quiet surface, I could feel something else unfolding, something that did not belong to our house, but was already taking shape somewhere else. It began in small ways, not with another phone call, but with silence that felt different. From before, heavier, more deliberate, as if decisions were being made without words. By late afternoon, that silence was broken, not directly to me, but through the kind of indirect paths that information tends to travel when it is no longer controlled. Robert's phone buzzed first, a short message from an old colleague who had once worked with Daniel's father, someone who still moved in circles we were no longer part of, but had not entirely disappeared from. Robert read it without reacting immediately, his expression steady, then handed the phone to me without comment. I glanced down at the screen, reading the brief message once, then again, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to be certain I was reading it correctly. Is everything all right with Emily's wedding? I heard the venue fell through this morning. People are talking. I handed the phone back to Robert, my fingers calm, my posture unchanged. It has started, he said quietly. I nodded once. Yes, I replied. There was no surprise in it, no satisfaction, only acknowledgement. I moved to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I stood by the counter, letting the moment settle without reacting to it. I had known this would not remain contained. Events like this rarely do. They expand, they reach outward, they gather attention, especially when expectations are high and appearances matter. And in Emily's world, appearances mattered more than most things. Not long after, my own phone lit up, not with her name, but with another number I recognized, Daniel's. I looked at it for a moment, considering whether to answer, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity about what the conversation might be. Then I accepted the call, bringing the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice calm, unchanged. "Mrs. Collins," Daniel said, his tone measured, polite, but carrying an undercurrent of tension he was trying to keep contained. "I hope you are doing well." I allowed a brief pause. "I am," I replied. "And you?" There was a slight shift on the other end, as if he had not expected the question to be returned. "I have been better," he admitted. "I wanted to ask you directly about the arrangements. There seems to have been some confusion." I leaned lightly against the counter, my gaze steady on the window ahead of me. "There is no confusion," I said. "The arrangements were canceled." Another pause, shorter this time, more focused. "May I ask why?" he said. His tone remained respectful, but I could hear the strain beneath it, the pressure of expectations pressing in from multiple directions. I chose my words carefully, not to soften them, but to keep them clear. "Because I am no longer part of the event," I replied. "And I do not continue to support something I have been excluded from." The line remained quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, less formal now, more direct. "Emily said there may have been a misunderstanding," he said. "That it was not meant to be taken this way." I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in recognition of how quickly situations are reframed when consequences appear. "There was no misunderstanding," I said evenly. "She was very clear." Daniel exhaled softly, the sound faint but noticeable. "This is creating a difficult situation," he said. "There are a lot of people involved, a lot of expectations." I nodded slightly, though he could not see it. "Yes," I said. "I am aware." There was another pause, longer now, as if he was considering how far to go, how much to say. "I do not think she anticipated this outcome," he added. "I do not think she thought." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but he did not need to complete it. The meaning was already there. I shifted my weight slightly, still steady, still grounded. "That is often the case," I said quietly. "People do not anticipate outcomes when they believe there will not be any." On the other end, I could hear movement again, voices in the background, more urgent now, less controlled, the sound of a situation expanding beyond its original boundaries. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "Is there any way to reconsider?" he asked. "At least partially? So that things can move forward." I let the question settle fully before answering, not because I needed time to decide, but because I believed in allowing the answer to carry its full weight without interruption. "No," I said calmly. "There is not." The word was simple, but it was complete. There was no hesitation, no condition, no opening for negotiation. Another silence followed, this one final in a way. The others had not been. "I understand," Daniel said at last, though his tone suggested that understanding and acceptance were not the same. "Thank you for speaking with me." "You are welcome," I replied. The call ended without further words, and I lowered the phone slowly, placing it back on the counter. For a moment, I stood there, not moving, not thinking ahead, just acknowledging the shift that had now fully extended beyond our home, beyond our immediate conversation, into a wider circle that could no longer be controlled or contained. In the living room, Robert remained seated, his posture unchanged, but his attention clearly focused. "Daniel?" he asked. I nodded once. "Yes," I said. He studied me for a moment, then leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "And?" I met his gaze, my voice steady, unchanged. "It is no longer just our situation," I said. "It is everyone's now." Robert gave a small, quiet nod, the kind that comes from recognizing a turning point when it arrives. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to shift, the shadows stretching longer across the street, the day continuing its steady progression toward evening, as if nothing had changed at all. But inside, I understood that something had reached a new stage, one where the consequences were no longer contained, where the choices made in a single conversation had begun to ripple outward in ways that could not be undone, only faced. The evening settled in slowly, the kind of gradual shift where daylight faded without urgency, leaving behind a soft dimness that made everything feel quieter, more contained. I stood by the window as the last of the sunlight slipped behind the houses across the street, watching as porch lights flickered on one by one, each home settling into its own version of the night. Inside, nothing had changed in a visible way, yet everything felt different in a way that could not be measured or pointed to directly. The phone remained silent for a while, long enough for the day to feel as though it might end without further interruption, but I knew better than to expect that. Situations like this do not resolve themselves quietly. They unfold in layers, each one revealing something new, something that was always there, but had not yet been forced into view. It was Robert's phone this time that broke the silence, the sharp vibration. Against the coffee table, drawing both of our attention at once. He glanced at the screen, his expression tightening, just slightly before he looked over at me. "It is her," he said. I nodded once. "Answer it," I replied. He picked up the phone and accepted the call, placing it on speaker without needing to ask. "Emily," he said, his voice steady, neither warm nor cold, simply present. There was no greeting on the other end, no attempt at easing into the conversation. "Dad, what is going on?" Emily's voice came through clearly, but the composure she had tried to maintain earlier was gone now, replaced by something more urgent, more exposed. "Everything is falling apart. The venue is gone. The caterer will not confirm anything, and Daniel's parents are asking questions I cannot answer. What did you and Mom do?" Robert did not respond immediately. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but attentive, giving the moment the space it needed before speaking. "Your mother has already explained the situation," he said calmly. "There is nothing more to add." There was a sharp exhale on the other end, the sound of someone trying to regain control of a situation that no longer responded to control in the same way. "This is not just about you," Emily said, her voice rising slightly. "There are other people involved. Important people. Do you understand what this looks like?" I remained where I was, listening, not stepping in, not interrupting, allowing the conversation to unfold without inserting emotion where it was not needed. Robert's tone did not change. "Yes," he said. "We understand exactly what it looks like." There was a pause, brief but noticeable. "Then why would you do this?" she pressed. "Why would you put me in this position?" Robert turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine for just a second before returning to the phone. "You made your position clear," he said. "We respected it." The simplicity of his response seemed to land harder than anything else that could have been said. "That is not the same thing," Emily replied quickly. "I did not ask you to ruin everything." I felt a quiet shift inside me, not anger, not frustration, but a recognition of the line she was drawing, the distinction she believed existed between exclusion and consequence. I stepped forward then, not abruptly, but with intention, and spoke. Before Robert could respond again. "You asked us not to be part of your wedding," I said, my voice calm, steady, carrying no raised edge. "This is what that means." There was silence on the other end, longer this time, as if the words had settled into a place she had not fully prepared to face. "You could have just accepted it," she said finally, her voice lower now, less certain. "You could have let things continue without making it worse." I held the phone in my gaze, though I was not the one holding it in my hand, and answered with the same clarity that had guided me through the entire day. "I did accept it," I said. "I accepted that we are not part of it. And I acted accordingly." Another pause followed, and this one felt different, not filled with resistance, but with something closer to realization, though not yet fully formed. "Daniel's family is asking if there is something wrong," she said, her voice quieter now. "They are questioning everything. They want explanations." I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it. "Then you should give them one," I replied. "A truthful one." The silence that followed stretched longer than any before it, and I could hear the shift in her breathing, the subtle change in rhythm that suggested she was no longer reacting, but thinking, perhaps for the first time since the situation had begun to unravel. "I cannot tell them that," she said finally, her voice almost a whisper. "It would make me look." She stopped, leaving the sentence unfinished, but the meaning was clear enough without the final word. I did not move, did not soften, did not adjust my tone. "It would make you look exactly as you chose to be seen," I said quietly. There was no accusation in the words, no sharpness, only a simple reflection of cause and effect, of decision and outcome. On the other end, The silence deepened, not empty, but full, as if something had finally reached a point where it could no longer be reshaped or avoided. Robert remained still beside me, his presence steady, his expression unchanged, allowing the moment to stand on its own. Outside, the streetlights had fully taken over, casting a soft, consistent glow across the neighborhood. The day now completely transitioned into night. I did not think it would go this far, Emily said at last, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of the control she had carried earlier. I let the words settle, not responding immediately, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to justify. When I did speak, it was not to argue, but to state what had already become clear. It already had, I said. The line remained open for a few seconds longer, neither of us speaking, the distance between us now defined not by silence, but by understanding that had arrived too late to change what had already been set in motion. Then, without another word, the call ended, leaving behind a quiet that no longer felt uncertain, but complete. The house was completely still after the call ended, not in a way that felt empty, but in a way that felt settled, as if something that had been building quietly for years had finally reached its natural conclusion. I remained where I was for a few moments, my hands resting lightly at my sides, my breathing steady, my thoughts no longer searching for answers that had already revealed themselves. Robert turned off the speaker and placed the phone back on the table with a calm that matched my own, neither of us needing to comment on what had just happened because we both understood it fully. That was the last of it, he said quietly. I nodded once. Yes, I replied. There was no hesitation in that answer, no uncertainty left to resolve. What had needed to unfold had unfolded, and what remained was not confusion, but clarity. We moved through the rest of the evening without discussing it further, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to examine. I washed the dishes slowly, drying each one with care before placing it back where it belonged, the simple routine grounding me in something steady and familiar. Robert adjusted the thermostat, checked the locks, and turned off the lights in the hallway, each action deliberate, each movement reflecting the quiet rhythm of a life that had not been disrupted, only redefined. Later, as we sat in the living room with the television playing softly in the background, I found myself no longer thinking about what had been said, but about what had been revealed. There is a difference between the two, I realized, a difference that only becomes clear when the noise fades, and what remains is the truth beneath it. It was not the words themselves that had changed anything. It was what those words confirmed, what they brought into the open without disguise or softening. I looked around the room then, at the photographs on the wall, at the furniture we had chosen together over the years, at the small details that had always defined our home, and I understood that nothing here had been diminished by what had happened. If anything, it had become more defined, more grounded, because it no longer relied on expectations that could be taken away. Do you think she understands? Robert asked after a while, his voice low, not pressing, just thoughtful. I considered the question carefully, not because it was difficult, but because it required honesty without assumption. Not yet, I said. But she will. Robert nodded slightly, accepting that without needing further explanation. Sometimes people only understand when they have to face the result of their own decisions, he said. I met his gaze, recognizing the quiet truth in his words. Yes, I replied. And sometimes that understanding comes later than they expect. The night deepened around us, the soft glow of the lamps casting a warm light across the room, the kind of light that makes everything feel steady and contained. I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hands together, feeling a sense of calm that had nothing to do with the absence of conflict, but everything to do with the presence of clarity. There was no need to anticipate what would happen next, no need to prepare for conversations that had not yet come. Whatever unfolded from this point forward would not change what had already been established. The lines had been drawn, not in anger, not in reaction, but in response to something that had been clearly defined. I stood after a while and walked to the hallway, turning off the final light before heading toward the bedroom, the familiar path feeling unchanged beneath my feet. Robert followed shortly after, his presence steady, his movements unhurried. As I lay down, pulling the blanket up just enough to feel its weight, I noticed that my mind was no longer replaying the events of the day, no longer searching for different ways things could have been handled. That part of me had already quieted, replaced by something more settled, more certain. The ceiling above me looked the same as it always had, the faint shadows shifting slightly with the movement of light from outside. And for the first time since everything had begun, I did not feel the need to analyze or question anything further. I simply observed, present in the moment, aware of the stillness that had taken the place of uncertainty. Beside me, Robert turned slightly, his hand resting near mine, not reaching, not needing to, just there, a quiet reminder of what remained constant. I closed my eyes slowly, not out of exhaustion, but out of a sense that the day had reached its natural end, not abruptly, but completely. There are moments in life that do not arrive with noise or spectacle, but with a quiet shift that changes everything in a way that cannot be reversed. This had been one of those moments, not because of what was lost, but because of what had been revealed, and as I let the darkness settle around me, I understood that the clarity I felt was not temporary, not dependent on what would happen next, but rooted in something far more stable, something that would remain long after the noise had faded and the consequences had fully unfolded. Morning arrived without urgency, the light easing into the room in a quiet, familiar way that did not demand attention, but simply existed, steady and unchanged. I opened my eyes slowly, not with the weight of unfinished thoughts, but with a sense of stillness that felt complete, as if something that had been unsettled for a long time had finally found its place. Beside me, Robert was already awake, lying on his back with his hands folded loosely over his chest, looking at the ceiling in the same thoughtful way he always had when he was not in a hurry to begin the day. He turned his head slightly when he noticed I was awake, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. There was no need to. The understanding between us did not require words anymore. I sat up slowly, letting my feet rest on the floor, feeling the solid, familiar surface beneath me, grounding in a way that did not depend on anything outside of this room. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from stability, from knowing that nothing inside it needed to be questioned or redefined again. I made my way to the kitchen, starting the coffee as I always did, measuring, pouring, waiting, the routine unfolding without interruption. The sound of the machine filled the space gently, and I stood there for a moment, watching the steady drip, thinking not about what had happened, but about what had changed within me because of it. Not everything that ends does so loudly. Some things simply reach a point where they no longer continue, and when they stop, what remains is not loss, but clarity. Robert joined me shortly after, taking his usual seat at the table, his movements calm, unhurried, his presence steady in the way that had always anchored our life together. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice quiet, not probing, just present. I poured 2 cups and set one in front of him before answering. "Clear," I said. The word was simple, but it held more than any longer explanation could have. He nodded slightly, accepting it without needing more. We sat together in silence, sipping our coffee, the morning unfolding around us in its usual rhythm, unchanged by what had come before, yet somehow more defined because of it. Outside, the street looked the same as it always did, neighbors beginning their day, cars moving slowly past, the ordinary flow of life continuing without pause. Somewhere beyond that, plans were still unraveling, conversations still happening, explanations still being given or avoided, but none of that reached into this space anymore. It no longer needed to. After a while, I stood and walked into the living room, pausing in front of the photographs again, not searching, not reflecting in the way I had before, but simply acknowledging. Each image remained what it had always been, a record of moments that were real when they happened, unchanged by what came after. I did not need to reconcile them with the present. They existed on their own, complete. I moved past them and opened the front door, stepping outside into the cool morning air, the temperature just below 60 degrees, crisp enough to feel awake, but not cold enough to be uncomfortable. I stood there for a moment, looking out at the street, breathing in the quiet, the stillness, the simple fact of being present without expectation. Robert joined me a minute later, standing beside me without speaking, our shoulders aligned as we looked out at the same view, not searching for anything, just observing what was already there. "We will be all right," he said after a while, his voice steady, certain, not as reassurance, but as a statement of fact. I nodded once, feeling the truth of it settle without resistance. We already are, I replied. There was no need to look back, no need to revisit what had already revealed itself. Some things do not require closure because they have already completed themselves in the moment they became clear. I took one more breath of the morning air, then turned back toward the house, stepping inside with a quiet sense of continuation rather than return. The door closed behind me with a soft, familiar sound, and as I walked back into the space that had always been ours, I understood that nothing essential had been taken away. What had changed was not what we had, but what we no longer held on to. And in that release, there was not emptiness, but a quiet, steady kind of freedom that did not need to announce itself to be real.